Beer doesn't seem to do much to remove dehydration, but it makes it easier to admit error. On the third bottle, I said to Laird, I think I can explain how we went wrong in locating the origin of Dodge's fire last year when Salih and Rumsey went with us into Mann Gulch. Laird said, I think I can too. We were back at the Fish and Game Commission ranch, had unloaded the saddle horses from the truck. We're now leaning on the front fenders of Laird's truck, one on each fender, both of them too hot to touch but not to lean against. We were too tired to sit down in the shade, if there was any, so we put the plastic bag with the rest of the beer between us on the hot hood of the engine. We figured since beer couldn't take away dehydration, we might as well drink it warm. I thought a lot about it, I said. I've thought a lot about it before today. That goes for both of us, Laird said. For a beginning, I tried to separate out the differences in basic evidence to explain how we were wrong. Oddities explain it, oddities of terrain and oddities of psychology. Although oddities of psychology aren't always as odd as they first seem. What's really odd is how the terrain and the psychology came together in odd ways. Within 15 minutes, we had pieced together an explanation with only minor differences between us. The first oddity that led us to error was that in 1978, for otherwise good reasons, we had approached Mann Gulch from Rescue Gulch. Approaching Mann Gulch from Rescue Gulch is approaching it from its side. So the first thing we saw of Mann Gulch was its northern ridge. That meant of key points in the fire we were trying to locate, we looked first for the crevice because it was the closest to us. Psychology also guaranteed that the crevice would be our first location point. Rumsey and Salih owed their lives to it. But it was a dangerous procedure to use the crevice as the starting point from which to reconstruct the tragedy that happened below it. Both Laird and I have already observed an oddity at the top of Mann Gulch, a pattern of terrain that reoccurs along the ridge. First, there's a wide open saddle where the reef has not extruded or more likely has eroded away. Then the reef emerges as a fairly solid cliff. Then the cliff lowers and splits into a crevice or several crevices. Then the reef erodes away into another wide open saddle, followed again by the reef appearing as a solid cliff, which again erodes into a crevice and further on into another wide open saddle, and so on up most of the ridge. Given this reoccurring pattern of open saddle, cliff, and crevice, it was dangerous to reconstruct our map according to the first crevice we found, because there are quite a few crevices on the Mann Gulch Ridge, and to Rumsey and Salih might look like the one they had squeezed through nearly 30 years ago in smoke and exhaustion. The game trail explains at least in part why we went wrong. We were naturally following it, and game naturally looked for the lowest place to cross the ridge, and the lowest place nearby was the wide open saddle up gulch from us. So we reached the top of the ridge side-hiddling up gulch, and up gulch is the way we kept going, although it turned out the game trail took us past the right crevice. It was behind us when we reached the top. Perhaps there's a greater oddity that permeated all these little oddities, one that perhaps influenced all our movements on the field of catastrophe that day. Part one of what I wanted to find out in Mann Gulch that year was how much two tough, able outdoorsmen would forget about the most unforgettable experience in their lives, and I felt fairly sure that part of the reason the two survivors came back to Mann Gulch with two amateur experts on the fire was that they were looking for answers to the same question. They wanted to see if they would recognize Armageddon if it were not in flames. Even the beginning to the answer I reached is complex and contrary to expectation. One, they remembered, seemingly with total recall, an incident on the periphery of their experience in which, after they were safe, they had tried to save one of the crew, Hellman. Two, their errors came when they tried to tie to reality the places most crucial to their own salvation, that is, origin of the escape fire, where they cut loose from their foreman and took their own lives in their own hands, and the crevice where they saved their lives. Almost certainly, ordinary expectations projected opposite conclusions. that they would remember most accurately the two crucial incidents in the most crucial moments of their lives, and that their memory for details would fade. But the fox went the other way, as the fox often does when the fox is psychology. What they remembered with remarkable accuracy is what happened after the fire passed them by, and they crawled out of their rock slide knowing at last that they were safe. The relocation of Hellman's Cross by the rusted can of Irish white potatoes is not the only example. I walked with Rumsey part of the way out of Rescue Gulch late that July one afternoon, and with nothing we were saying to bring this up, he said to me, "This is where I first saw the rescue crew the night of the fire when I started for the Missouri River to get water for Hellman." It had been about midnight when he had met the rescue crew coming up, and the rise we were standing on was not particularly distinguishable, and there are many not particularly distinguishable rises on the several finger ridges running down the slope of Rescue Gulch. "Look down this ridge," he said, and I did. "See that big rock with two smaller ones near it? I could see something like some big rocks 200 yards down ridge. Well," he said, "they were coming up this ridge. They naturally had their flashlights on, but I didn't see their flashlights because they were coming up behind the rocks. I could see the lights reflected in the sky, but the first I knew that they were behind the rocks is when the rocks appeared out of the dark and began to glow. Suddenly, flashlights blinked between the big rocks and the little ones, and I yelled to the rocks." And any psychological generalization can be based on this day in Mann, if any psychological generalization could be based on this day in Mann Gulch, it would be something like this. We don't remember as exactly the desperate moments when our lives were in the balance as we remember the moments after when the balance has tipped in our favor. We know we're safe and have turned to helping others. Even if this is something of an explanation, it leaves unexplained what we mean by remember. In Rumsey and Sally's memory, the experience of their flight from death is not bound together by narrative or cartographic links. It would be hard to make a map from it and then expect to find ground to fit the map. It has the consistency more of a gigantic emotional cloud that closes things together with mist, either obliterating the rest of the objective reality or moving the remaining details of reality around until, like furniture, they fit into the room of our nightmares in which only a few pieces appear, where they're in reality. There is always a good deal of housekeeping going on in our dreams. Sometimes I think there's only one remembered objective detail that gives position to whatever else is remembered of outer reality. Most certainly our day in Mann Gulch was made to fit the crevice. So it had taken us 3 years to locate two places on the ground, a summer to discover whether any survivors still had addresses on this earth, then a winter to induce the two still alive to return to the top of the ridge they had been trying to forget, followed by a summer when they came back and were ghosts for a day, and then still another summer for Laird and me to find out that they had been successful in forgetting certain things. 3 years and 2 established locations. It doesn't seem like much, even though we had been following a lot of other trails during those years leading to parts of the story of the Mann Gulch fire. Trails of experts on death, especially death by fire, and many trails of Earl Cooley, who with his partner was the first ever to drop on a forest fire from a parachute and who tapped the calf of the left leg of each of those about to die in Mann Gulch to get them on their last jump. Later I was to see the sad tale of the once majestic C-47 that had dropped its crew into Mann Gulch when the great bird of the sky circled the airstrip in Missoula and disappeared forever into the blue, sold into slavery to an African company. Stories and stories. A storyteller has all kinds of stories going at one time out of which he hopes he can find one story he can tell at one time. I had decided that a search for the main line of the multiple stories should include an attempt to determine the speed of men and of fire in their race between established points and to relate the decreasing distance between men and fire with the tragically increasing intensity of the fire's heat. I did try to proceed in this quest by closely studying the survivors' testimony concerning the closing gap between them and the fire. But the testimony in such circumstances naturally lacks exactness and even agreement, And before long, Laird and I came to the precipice of doubt with the discovery that official testimony about the time and distance of the race may have been tampered with. For an interval, we thought there was no way of going any further with this part of the story until and unless a method could be found of ascertaining time and distance and speed other than by pacing and grade school arithmetic. In my often aimless visits to the smoke jumper base, I almost always had to pass the Northern Forest Fire Laboratory, where without my realizing it, they were developing such a method. I had already heard, usually from young members of the Forest Service, that in the Northern Forest Fire Lab, they made mathematical models of fires. And I was mildly curious, though I didn't know much more about mathematical models of fire than that they were used in the operation of the National Fire Danger Rating System, and so have something to do with predicting the rate of spread on any given day of forest fires, real or hypothetical. Occasionally I would say to myself, someday when I'm too old to chase real forest fires, I'll come back here and try to find out what a mathematical model of a forest fire is, if by then it is not too late. So I would keep on going past the fire lab to where they would be a bunch of visitors watching a game of volleyball being played with surprising ferocity by young men who also, to the surprise of the visitors, were not as big as the Minnesota Vikings. When the game was over, the young men would return to the loft, and to the ever-increasing surprise of the visitors, would sit in front of sewing machines and peacefully mend their parachutes. They were very skillful with their sewing machines, and damn well better have been, since their lives hung on their parachutes. On a good many days in my search for the story of the Mann Gulch fire, I never got any further than the loft. At one end of it was a glass cage containing the loft foreman, Hal Samsel. Hal is the son of a Forest Service ranger and was born in a ranger station, and all his own professional life has been in the Forest Service, most of it in the smoke jumpers. In fact, in early August of 1949, he had just returned to the smoke jumper base from an earlier fire, or his number would have been called to go to Mann Gulch. There isn't much he doesn't know about the woods, whether viewed from the ground or the sky, and he can tell stories about the woods from either perspective. He's a master storyteller, the only one I ever heard who could tell the whole story with only 2 grammatical subjects. Them sons of bitches, he said, opening with his first subject, was Mennonites who wouldn't fight in the last war, and they wasn't afraid to work or die for their country, but wouldn't kill anybody. So somebody, maybe for this somebody's idea of a joke, had them sent to the smoke jumpers. Turned out the sons of bitches was farm boys, and what's more, didn't believe in using machines, no way. Working was just for their hands and their horses. And them sons of bitches took them shovels and saws and Pulaskis and put a hump in their backs. It never straightened up until morning, and when they had a fire line around the whole damn fire, them sons of bitches was the world's champion firefighters. His second grammatical subject he saved for the end. The rest of us bastards, he said, was dead by midnight. Many days my many-purpose quest for the Mann Gulch fire never got me further than one of Hal's stories. But a storyteller should never look at a day as lost if he has learned something about how to tell stories, especially how to make them shorter. By the time I knew only where the crevice and the foreman's fire were in the main story of Mann Gulch, I already knew most of the other part of the story. I already knew there would be such a part, and I knew I would search for it when I first saw the fire itself and the black burned ghost of a deer bleeding where its skin had melted. I knew I would write about this the moment I had discovered we had not thrown a rifle into the cab of the truck, and so could only hope the deer would die soon. It was at this moment that I knew my story of the Mann Gulch fire would have a part in it, asking the question, did any good at all come of this? My father has a way of making his presence felt in any story I tell, even when he isn't a character in it. He was a Presbyterian minister and kept me out of school and taught me himself until the juvenile officers caught up with me. In retrospect, I think the experience of listening to me recite the Westminster Catechism influenced his own literary style and perhaps even mine in later years. My guess is that my interest in this question of whether any good resulted from the Mann Gulch fire goes all the way back to a sentence of his which sounds as if it comes out of the Westminster Catechism, but it doesn't. It is enough, though, that it sounds like him. One of the chief privileges of man is to speak up for the universe. And I like that. Could be that we ask this big question almost the first thing of all, because the question seems to ask itself without being asked. It has to be one of man's first questions after he discovers he has personal connections with death. And I had asked it about the Mann Gulch fire long enough to have collected a fairly solid answer to a part of it. The report of Board of Review had divided into 2 sub-questions, and I had accepted the division to make answering easier. The report's final recommendation was to, quote, continue and intensify efforts in the study of fire behavior to furnish more dependable basis for anticipating blowups, and to intensify training of firefighter overhead in this respect, end of quote. So I had long been asking myself, did this tragic fire help to increase the scientific knowledge about fire behavior in ways that help modern firefighters keep out of death traps? And did this tragic fire help to improve the training of firefighters in ways that would add to their safety? I had the additional private hope that something would come out of the tragedy that would circle back and help to explain what had been inexplicable about it. The old-timer in the Forest Service I feel closest to, Bud Moore, had been top man in firefighting in Region 1 of the Forest Service as Director of Fire Control and Aviation Management. After Bud retired from the Forest Service, he built a beautiful log cabin on the side of a Mission glacier only 35 miles from my cabin, and I often go up to see him. One morning, I woke with the feeling that I was about ready to write an answer to one of the first questions my father would have asked about the Mann Gulch fire. This feeling, when generalized, is a feeling that you will be ready to write it first if you can find the right friend to listen to your opening paragraph. I drove the 35 miles to Bud's. Before starting to talk, we took a pail down the mountainside to his spring bubbling with underground water melted from the glacier above, and I dug out a bottle of Ancient Age from the trunk of my car. When Ancient Age and ice water are sloshed around at a tin cup, the water is just as good as the whiskey. Afterwards, I went back to my cabin to write on the effects the tragedy at Mann Gulch fire had on the know-how of firefighters. And what I wrote comes next, and Bud Moore was the first to check it. The Mann Gulch fire is the smoke jumpers' lone tragedy on the fire line. 2 jumpers have since died while jumping, caught and hanged in the coils of their own jumping ropes, but the fact that the smoke jumpers have suffered no fatality from fire since Mann Gulch suggests they learned some things from it. Those who knew something about the woods or about nature should soon have perceived an alarming gap between the almost sole purpose, clear but narrow, of the early smoke jumpers and the reality they were sure to confront. Reality almost anywhere having inherent in it the principle that little things suddenly and literally can become big as hell, and ordinary can suddenly become monstrous, and the up-gulch breeze suddenly can turn to murder. Since this principle comes about as close to being universal as a principle can, you might have thought someone in the early history and training of the smoke jumpers would have realized that something like the Mann Gulch fire would happen before long. But no one seems to have sensed this first principle because of a second principle inherent in the nature of man, namely that generally a first principle can't be seen until after it's been written up as a tragedy and becomes a second principle. In their early days, the smoke jumpers were still cautious and were still primarily limited in aim to getting on fires as soon as possible while they were small and could be put out quickly. As we have seen, the crew on Mann Gulch fire was practically devoid of experience on big fires. For instance, according to the report of Board of Review, the second in command, Hellman, in 1947 had been on 4 Class A fires, that's less than 1/4 of an acre, 2 Class B fires, 1/4 to 9 acres, and 1 Class C fire, 10 to 99 acres. In 1948, the year before Mann Gulch, he'd been on 2 Class C fires. The almost total experience each crew member had as a firefighter was being almost his own boss on almost his own fire, where for most practical purpose he was the only man who was in a position to save his own life. One thing for sure, being almost boss of your own body and completely captain of your own soul makes you damn fast and certain of your own decisions. Not long in coming, though, was the answer to the question, What might well happen to a bunch of early smoke jumpers when they take on a small fire that for whatever reason suddenly becomes big? The answer to the question gets almost inevitable when it's asked in this form. What might well happen to a bunch of early smoke jumpers who are dropped on a good-sized fire which looks ordinary when they land but suddenly blows up? The inevitable answer has to be something like the Mann Gulch tragedy. Before long, the thing out there in nature has a way of finding the heel of Achilles. The Mann Gulch tragedy immediately became a flaming symbol to the smoke jumpers and the firefighters generally, especially those in the Northwest. Fortunately, there are a lot of able woodsmen in the Forest Service who don't wait around for the Forest Service to do something, and it was some of these who said to me not long after the fire, "God damn it, no man of mine is ever going to die that way." Small cracks were soon filled, and especially with technical improvements. For instance, there was widespread concern about the breakdowns in the communication systems that occurred during the fire, the failure of telephone or radio calls to be completed, and much was made of the fact that the crew's radio had been shattered on the jump because its parachute had failed to open. As a result of these and similar failures, immediately and on the whole, helpful changes were made, such a simple requirement that crews must carry a backup radio. But there were deeper and more conscience-stricken improvements. Among the overhead, there was an intense heightening of the realization that at all moments on a fire, their primary responsibility is the safety of their crew, and that controlling the fire is only secondary. Many smoke jumper foremen have told me that since the Mann Gulch tragedy, they don't make a move on a fire without first asking the question, if I go there, where can I escape with my crew if the thing blows up? And if they don't like their own answer, they don't go. To carry out this commitment, the overhead have to do more than constantly pledge themselves to the safety of their crews. At all moments on a fire, they must have a fully operational communication system to furnish them with the best information available on which to base decisions involving the safety of their men, insofar as the moment permits. There must be no failure in direct observation, scouting, or radio and telephone communications. The training of the crews was also improved in many particulars. For instance, their physical conditioning was stiffened, and their knowledge of fire behavior, especially of large fires, was extended. Also broadened was their schooling in the difference between the behavior of fires burning in the dense forests west of the Continental Divide and the behavior of fires burning in the dry grass and shrubs east of the Divide, where little rain is left in the clouds that have been blown across mountain ranges from the Pacific Ocean. All these things add up, but the greatest concern was to remove the contradictions between training men to act swiftly, surely, and on their own in the face of danger, and on the other hand, training men to take orders unhesitatingly when working under command. On a big fire, there is no time and no tree under whose shade the boss and crew can sit and have a platonic dialogue about a blow-up. If Socrates had been foreman on the Mann Gulch fire, he and his crew would have been cremated while they were sitting there considering it. Dialogue doesn't work well when the temperature is approaching the lethal 140 degrees. In this delicate job of picking and training smoke jumpers so they will have almost opposite qualities, it won't do at all to pick men who accept orders without question just because they are reticent or even retarded. They have to be so smart that they know there are times when their lives depend on not asking questions. Picking and training such men is like trying to make Marines out of civilians, but the smoke jumpers have done it, and indeed the example of the Marines has helped them do it. In 1949, many of the jumpers were veterans of World War II, and 12 of those on the Mann Gulch fire had been in military service during the war. The live and the dead have joined together to make the smoke jumpers into a semi-military outfit. If a jumper now disregards the orders of his foreman on a fire, he has just made his last jump, fought his last fire, and started for camp to pick up his last paycheck. It is worth repeating that in the nearly 40 years since the Mann Gulch tragedy, no smoke jumper has died on a fire line. Some of the changes and safety procedures that helped to establish this proud record are concrete, objective safety measures, such as the addition to training courses of experience in fighting grass fires, especially on steep slopes. But the large underlying changes are more atmospheric, like being constantly aware that one risks one's life in fighting fire for a livelihood, and that sometimes saving one's life depends entirely upon taking one's life in one's own hands, and that at other times one's life and the lives of others must be put entirely into the hands of one's boss. Old lessons that throughout time have to be learned and relearned only to be forgotten again. The one invention that came out of Mann Gulch and was immediately made a part of the training course for firefighters is the escape fire. It was spectacular. It had saved Dodge's life and soon became a permanent part of the common knowledge of forest firefighters. One of those it has saved is Rod McIver, now the Dean of Smoke Jumpers at the Missoula base, whose story appears in Reader's Digest, February 1976, under the title Trapped in a Sea of Flame, Drama in Real Life. In 1957, after a succession of bad fire years, Richard E. McCardle, chief forester at the time, appointed a top-flight task force to recommend further action needed in both administration and research to materially reduce the chances of men being killed by burning while fighting fires. For scientific data, the task force took the 16 tragic fires that had occurred in national forests since 1936 and looked for threads that run through all or most of them. For special study, the task force selected 5 classic examples, one of which was the Mann Gulch fire. The task force itself was made up of 5 members, outstanding representatives of the Forest Service overhead from regional forester, a region being the Forest Service largest administrative unit, to ranger, who's in charge of the Forest Service most basic unit in the field, the district. Bud Moore, then ranger of the famous Powell district on the Waxhaw River in Idaho, was selected to represent the point of view of rangers about fatal fires. The task force developed a practical set of recommendations, and at a meeting in Washington, D.C., it was decided these orders should be modeled on the military service's general orders. When nobody at the meeting had a copy of the general orders, Bud Moore, who had been a Marine all over the Pacific in World War II, found a Marine standing outside at a bus stop, and together they quickly reconstructed the Marines' general orders, which became the model for the Forest Service's 10 standard firefighting orders. Standard firefighting orders. 1. Fire weather, keep informed of fire weather conditions and predictions. 2. Instructions, know exactly what my instructions are and follow them at all times. 3. Write things first. Identify the key points of my assignment and take action in order of priority. 4. Escape plan. Have an escape plan in mind and direct subordinates in the event of a blow-up. 5. Scouting. Thoroughly scout the fire for which I am responsible. 6. Communication. Establish and maintain regular communication with adjoining forces, subordinates, and superior officers. 7. Alertness. Quickly recognize changed conditions and immediately revise plans to handle. 8. Lookout. Post a lookout for every possible dangerous situation. 9. Discipline. Establish and maintain control of all men under my supervision and at all times know where they are and what they are doing. 10. Supervision. Be sure men I commit to any fire job have clear instructions and adequate overhead. These orders were issued to Forest Service personnel in the form of a training program supported by a case study of a classic fatal fire to illustrate each of the 10 orders. The Mann Gulch fire was used to illustrate one of these orders, but actually all the orders could have grown out of the Mann Gulch fire, except the 1 or 2 relevant only to commanding very large crews. Their crosses are quiet and a long way off, and from this remove their influence is quiet and seemingly distant, but quietly they are present on every fire line, even though those whose lives they are helping to protect know only the order and not the fatality it represents. For those who crave immortality by name, clearly this is not enough, but for many of us, it would mean a great deal to know that by our dying, we are often to be present in times of catastrophe, helping to save the living from our deaths.